Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I'm your host, Clyde, and today we've made it to the top of the mountain, the 10 best winning games in the history of Survivor. This is the final edition of this series, so if you missed my analysis of your favorite winner, check out the previous 4 parts. Last week, I focused on the 20 through 11 selections, which included iconic winners like Parvati Shallow, Tyson Apostle, and Natalie Anderson. With that out of the way, let's get back into the ranking. On to number 10, we can jump into the second to last tier of this list called Majority Dominance. These winners held strategic agency for just about the entire season. They direct the game to their winning combination with a couple small bumps in the road. Some of these winners forfeited control temporarily, while others are blindsided by production-infused advantages. These winners differ from those in the flawed dominance tier in that they are never in serious danger of going home, and they are rarely excluded from the consensus plan. Then at number 10, we got a winner who has an argument for the most strategically dominant performance in the history of the show. That's enough to put this winner in the top 10, but his atrocious social game holds him back from the highest tier of this list. It's Brian Heidik, the winner of Survivor Thailand. On this season, we see Brian perfect old-school Survivor strategy. He follows that blueprint of forming a stable alliance within his original tribe, voting out every member of the opposing tribe in the early merge, then navigating to the end with his core allies. What distinguishes Brian from other old-school winners is his degree of control within his primary alliance. Every person in that group genuinely considered Brian their number one ally, and as a result, his name is not written down once this entire season. Out of the gate, Brian locks down his main alliance on the Chewigan tribe with the likes of Ted, Helen, Jan, and Clay. In episode 7, production runs the weird fake merge twist where he's initially in a 5-5 split according to original tribal lines. Before the reveal of that fake merge, Brian actually convinces Sheehan to flip over to his side, so he was prepared to take control of the game even if production elected to not include that twist. We get the real merge at Final 8, where Brian's side holds the 5-3 numbers advantage, and they pick off every member of the original Sukjai tribe in Ken, then Penny, then Jake. By the final 5, Brian is very socially insulated, as every remaining player intends on rolling with him to the final tribal. He cuts Ted at 5, then at final 4, he makes an interesting play in voting out Helen. When I first watched Thailand, I disagreed with that decision by Brian. In my mind, Brian should have taken Helen to the final 3 alongside Clay because Helen and Clay despised each other. With that hypothetical trio, Brian would guarantee himself a spot in the final tribal council. That's all great, but the issue with that approach is Brian's relatively lower winning stock. If Helen won final immunity and brought Brian to the end, she probably beats him in a jury vote. Brian's goal at Final 4 was to maximize his chances of reaching the end in his only winning scenario against Clay. By cutting Helen at 4, Brian takes 53-year-old Jan to the final 3, who would likely lose that final immunity challenge. That plan works out perfectly as Brian wins final immunity, takes Clay to the final tribal, and narrowly wins the season in a 4-3 jury vote. From a strictly strategic perspective, this is an all-time win, but Brian's jury management needs to impact this ranking. Despite presenting a way better strategic resume, Brian barely beats Clay, who was hated by the Thailand jury. Brian probably loses most other Final Tribal Council combinations. He made zero real effort to connect with any members of the Chewigan tribe. All 3 of them vote for Clay in the Final Tribal. While Brian earns all 4 of the Sukjai tribe's votes, even those felt shaky. In case you don't know, there were rumors post-season that Brian made racial remarks on the island that were nearly brought up by Ken at the Final Tribal. If Ken comes forward with that information, Brian potentially loses Ted's vote, which costs him the win. Clay is widely regarded as one of the worst finalists in the history of the show, so it's ridiculous that this jury vote was that close. I think that Brian's Thailand game has a real argument for the worst winning social game in the history of the show. At the end of the day, I need to fall back on my criteria for this list. At their core, these are strategically centric rankings, which elevates Brian all the way to the number 10 spot. At number 9, I got the final winner on this list from Old School Survivor in Tina Wesson, the winner of Survivor the Australian Outback. Tina is one of those winners that shot up my rankings through my research for this project. In my initial draft for this list, I had Tina around 10 spots lower. My original concern with Tina's game was her outlook on her strategic dominance. While Tina is in control for all of Season 2, she perceives Survivor through this moral lens. Tina justifies many of her voting decisions by claiming that she wants to bring deserving people to the end. As far as the edit is concerned, Tina does not look at Survivor with much strategic forethought. Now, it's important to acknowledge the cultural expectations surrounding this early season. In the first season of the show, Richard Hatch was painted as a villain for his strategic outlook on the game. There is a chance that Tina kept her strategic perspective a secret as a way to maintain her reputation. At the end of the day, though, I don't know if Tina's intent really matters. She still runs the game from beginning to end, which is enough to earn her a spot in this majority dominance tier. Early on, Tina is on the outside of the Ogakor tribe, but she works to create a stable power structure. In their third tribal council, she has a really impressive move in convincing Colby to flip to work with her and Keith in taking out Mitchell. After that vote, Tina has this 5-person Onion alliance set in stone where she is positioned in the middle. Tina then enters the merge tied in numbers against the opposing Kucha alliance. Now, it's important to remember that Michael Skupin was medically evacuated from the Kucha tribe in the last episode of the pre-merge. Without that medevac, there is a chance that Tina's tribe loses the immunity challenge and she walks into the merge down in numbers where she's likely picked off. So that's a luck-based scenario that breaks Tina's way. But anyways, at the merge, Tina makes an insightful play in throwing the immunity challenge to her ally Keith. At that point in Survivor history, tied votes were broken based on the number of previous votes received. Tina knew that Keith had his name written down more times than anyone else in her alliance. So by helping him win that challenge, she increased the odds of her side winning that initial battle. That goes exactly according to plan as the Okakor alliance takes control and votes out members of the opposing tribe in Varner, followed by Alicia. Going into the final 8, I expected Tina to continue picking off those bottom feeders, but she pivots and knocks out Jerry from her own alliance. Part of me appreciates that Tina was willing to deviate a bit from the old school Survivor approach of voting out every member of the opposing tribe before cannibalizing your own. At the same time, by taking out Jerry at 8, Tina's Ogakor group barely maintains the 4-3 numbers advantage in the following round. One of Tina's allies was Amber, who was very close with Jerry. There was a real risk there of Amber responding and flipping against Tina. Obviously, that doesn't happen, but I don't know if Amber's loyalty was based more in Amber's connection to Tina or the timing of this season. At this point in Survivor history, we had never seen a player completely flip against their primary alliance, which likely factored into Amber's decision. At the end of the day, Amber sticks by Tina's side, and from there, Tina is able to vote out those players on the periphery and navigate to the final 3 with her core allies of Colby and Keith. Arguably, the best aspect of Tina's win is her late-game positioning, where both Keith and Colby intended on bringing her to the end, and she defeats either of them in a jury vote. However, those endgame scenarios are not equal. Tina narrowly beats Colby in a 4-3 jury vote, whereas she potentially sweeps the jury against Keith. Even though Keith is clearly the easier beat in the end, Tina intended on rolling with Colby to the final tribal, which is a concern for me. Overall, I feel that Tina played a dominant game of Survivor. She orchestrates the vote against Mitchell in the pre-merge, which sets herself up with a path to the end once her side gained the numbers advantage. You can definitely fault Tina for either her reasoning behind her decisions or simply the strategic level of the surrounding cast, but those negatives are relatively minor for me. When you look at Tina's performance on paper, there is never a round where she's out of the loop or following the strategic decisions of her allies. It's the best winning game of old school Survivor. It ranks her here at number 9. Then at number 8, I have who I consider the most underrated winner in the history of Survivor. I put this contestant in the top 10 of my player ranking because this winning game is so impressive. It's Tommy Sheehan, the winner of Survivor Island of the Idols. I feel that Tommy's win on IOI is defined by his adaptability. This is a game where Tommy is constantly thrown into unlucky scenarios through circumstances outside his control. Tommy makes the best of those spots, and he still dominates the season strategically. Tommy gets his way in almost every tribal council. Off the bat, he's in the majority of the Vokai tribe, which takes out Mali in their first tribal council. At the swap, Tommy is pushed into a tribe of 8 where there was an even 4-4 split. There, he convinces the opposing Lyro contestants to flip on their own in taking out Aaron. Tommy had the numbers in place for that move, but it's ultimately blown up by Elaine receiving a vote block on the Island of the Idols. That advantage enables Elaine to flip the vote onto Jason, one of Tommy's closest allies. That pre-merge tribal is the only point in the season where Tommy loses control. It's still a knock against him, but it's also a round that was heavily influenced by advantages which Tommy could not account for. Following that vote, Tommy is not in the best position. That swap tribe does not attend another pre-merge tribal council, but had that happened, Tommy potentially receives some votes. Tommy's game flips at the merge, and everything from that point forward is completely directed by him. I know that the common criticism with Tommy is that his number one ally Lauren ran the show, and he served as her second in command. I fully disagree with that outlook. I see Tommy as the head strategic player in that duo, which is revealed by the boot order in the post-merge. Tommy and Lauren were aligned with each other, but they maintained secondary alliances outside their connection. When it came down to it, Lauren sacrificed many of her pawns in the early merge, like Aaron, Missy, and Elizabeth, while Tommy kept his around for the back half of the game. By the time they reached the final 6, every remaining contestant was more loyal to Tommy than Lauren. En route to that point, Tommy overcomes more adversity. In the split tribal, he's randomly thrown into a group where he's outnumbered 4-1 by the opposing Lyro alliance. If the Lyros take him out there, they walk into the final 9 with the numbers advantage. Yet Tommy is such a great social player that he convinces them to flip on their own and vote out Missy instead. That move gives Tommy's side the numbers. It's arguably the most important vote of the entire season. Tommy and Lauren then run the game between the final 9 and final 6. In that stretch, Tommy locks down a final 3 deal with Dan and Dean, where he easily would have won the season. That plan falls apart when Dan is ejected from the game at the final 6. I agree with production's decision to remove Dan, but from a strategic perspective, this was a massive blow for Tommy. Not only did Tommy lose a core ally, but that round pushes some of the bigger jury threats like Janet and Lauren deeper into the game. Tommy intended on taking out both of them earlier, but he was essentially forced into a tighter window. Without that ejection, Tommy votes out Janet at 6 and Lauren at 5. He would have sat in the final 4 with 3 allies who all intended on riding with him to the end. After the Dan boot, Tommy adapts again. He sets up a new final 3 deal with Dean and Nora. At final 5, he works with Dean in taking Janet out of the game by using an idol nullifier on her. Then at final 4, Nora wins final immunity. Earlier in the season, Nora promised to take Dean to the end, yet when it comes down to it, she decides to bring Tommy, which is insane. It shows just how well connected Tommy was with everyone on the island. Dean then defeats Lauren in firemaking, which is great for Tommy. The biggest knock for me against Tommy's game is the fact that Lauren has a good shot at beating him in a jury vote. I've ran this simulation in the past, but in that hypothetical final tribal between Lauren, Tommy, and Nora, it's a close battle that's probably decided by the jury votes of Jamal and Aaron. I don't know who wins that scenario, which is a negative for Tommy in that he reaches the final 4 with a potentially bigger jury threat. At the same time though, Tommy never intended on bringing Lauren to that point. He was forced to ride with her deeper into the season due to the Dan ejection. Tommy then defeats Dean and Nora in a 8-2-0 jury vote. There again, it's impressive that Tommy was able to navigate into a comfortable winning scenario despite so many luck-based events not breaking his way. Tommy's game on IOI is such a great win in that we see him dominate the game in multiple strategic positions. He plays from the top for most of the post-merge, and he plays from the bottom in that split tribal council. In my opinion, this win launches Tommy into an elite tier of Survivor players. I'll put him here at number 8. On to number 7, we can cover the other 2-time winner on this list. Both of this contestant's wins ranked in the top 10. There was some debate over which game was more impressive, but for me, here at number 7, I got Tony Vlachos with his second win on Survivor Winners at War. Now, I understand that many people would rank Tony's win here at the number 1 spot, as it's arguably the most impressive winning game in the history of the show. Tony plays against the highest quality of competition that we've ever seen. 19 previous winners, many of which rank in my top 50 players. That alone skyrockets my opinion of Tony, the Survivor player, but when I look strictly at his navigation through the season, there are some rough points. The difficult aspect with this ranking is the origin of those blunders. Whenever Tony is poorly positioned or unable to achieve his ideal outcome, it's not due to any real strategic mistake on his end. Like Tommy, who I ranked at number 8, Tony is very unlucky on Winners at War. The Edge of Extinction twist constantly throws him into unlucky scenarios that weaken his strategic stranglehold on the season. For me, that loss of control is much less damning for Tony as it was facilitated by external factors, but it still happened. Tony, along with the rest of this cast, knew about the Edge of Extinction gimmick before filming, and I don't think that Tony played well around that component. At the end of the day, though, everything outside those last couple rounds where Natalie returns to the game is very impressive for Tony. He opens the season on the DeKal tribe where he's positioned on the periphery of the main power structure. He survives 2 tribal councils in that spot, but he is not the lead person directing the vote onto either Amber or Tyson. Tony's early game is a bit rocky in terms of strategic agency, but I will credit him for his threat level management. In the early pre-merge, many players were focused on breaking up dynamic duos. We see both the Natalie-Jeremy alliance and the Amber-Rob pairing separated in just the premiere. Tony walked into Winners at War with a clear number 1 ally in Sarah Lacina positioned on the same tribe. Tony and Sarah are widely regarded as 2 of the most dominant winners in the history of the show, yet they're both able to fly under the radar through the first 4 episodes. Moving ahead to the swap, Tony attends the legendary Queenslayer Tribal Council, where Denise plays 2 idols. As a result, Tony is just one of 3 vulnerable contestants, yet no one writes his name down. In fact, Denise reported post-season that she had no intention of voting against Tony due to the relationship that he cultivated with her. It's a clear example of Tony working around external advantages through his social gameplay. We get to the merge, and this is where Tony really takes control, playing a more loyal version of his Cagayan game. He starts by picking off many of those players outside his main alliance, like Wendell, Adam, and Tyson. At Final 9, Tony pulls off potentially the most impressive strategic play in the history of the show. In that round, he correctly identifies Sophie as the player in the middle of the dominant alliance. He plans on gathering the votes against her, only for that scheme to be disrupted by the extortion disadvantage played against him by Natalie from the Edge of Extinction. Tony adapts accordingly, and he convinces 3 players to give him the fire tokens necessary to bypass the disadvantage. He then wins individual immunity and orchestrates the Sophie blindside, taking her out of the game through a plurality vote with an idol in her pocket. This move from Tony not only showcases his ability to overcome adversity on multiple fronts, but it positions him perfectly for the back half of the post-merge. By cutting Sophie and rebuilding his relationship with Sarah, Tony puts himself in the power seat. He's still got his core alliance with Sarah, Ben, and Denise, but he's also well connected with many of the peripheral players like Jeremy and Nick. Tony then dominates the game for the next couple rounds, cutting his biggest opposition in Kim at the final 8, followed by Jeremy at final 7 and Nick at final 6. Going into the final 5, Tony is set up perfectly to run the endgame. His original plan was to navigate to the final tribal alongside Ben and Sarah, where he easily wins a jury vote. That entire outlook is interrupted once again by the Edge of Extinction. Natalie returns to the game with an idol where she immediately paints a target on Tony's back. Keep in mind that Natalie just spent the last 30 plus days of the game with those jury members on the edge, so her perspective had a lot of credibility. Due to Natalie's return, Tony stumbles through those last 3 rounds. At final 6, he correctly anticipates Natalie's possession of an idol, but he's unable to convince his alliance to split the vote. That forces Tony to sacrifice his own idol at Tribal Council, and he votes out Denise. Then at Final 5, he has the numbers in place to cut Michelle, only for Ben to essentially quit the game. Ben advises Sarah to vote with Natalie and Michelle against him as a way for her to build her resume and make a move that excludes Tony. Tony is left out of that plan, which is obviously bad, but I still see that Tribal Council as a round influenced by the Edge of Extinction. Without Natalie returning to the game and pointing the finger at Tony, Ben does not know that Sarah is underestimated by the jury, so he never has the motivation to give her this big move at Tribal Council. By the final four, Tony stands as the biggest jury threat on the board. Both Natalie and Michelle intend on sending him into the fire-making challenge, which is not great. At the same time, according to postseason interviews, Sarah still wanted to ride with Tony to the end, which is insane given Natalie's comments from the edge. I think it's really impressive that Tony was able to keep that alliance intact despite Sarah receiving so many signals suggesting that she would lose to Tony. Tony then beats Sarah in fire-making, and he reaches the final tribal against Natalie and Michelle, where he wins in a 12-4-0 jury vote. In terms of win equity, Tony was elite this season. I don't know if there was anyone in the late game that had a chance of beating him in a jury vote. So all in all, I look at Tony's Winners at War game as a much improved version of Tommy's win on IOI. Both of them dominated their respective seasons, but they lost control at points due to external factors. While those low points are excusable, I can't look past them entirely. I'll put Tony here at number 7. Then at number 6, I got the same player. It's Tony Vlachos, this time with his first win on Survivor Cagayan. Tony's game on Season 28 is definitely one of the more chaotic and entertaining runs in Survivor history. Many people look at Cagayan as one of the best Survivor seasons, and I think that reputation stems in part from the gameplay of Tony. Unlike most other winners on this list, Tony runs the show from the middle. He's constantly flipping back and forth between alliances in a way that's only paralleled by Sarah Lucina, who we discussed earlier. Tony's Cagayan win is a personal favorite of mine, but there's still some minor flaws in this run. Initially, Tony is on the outside of the Braun tribe, but he's able to build connections with the likes of Trish, Sarah, and Wu. Had that group attended a tribal council in the early pre-merge, Tony had the numbers in place to knock out Cliff. At the swap, Tony accomplishes this goal of taking out Cliff in a move that serves to build new alliances with players outside the original Braun tribe. At the time, I know there was a lot of debate surrounding that decision from Tony, but through that move, Tony gains the trust of Jeffra and LJ. Both of them worked as essential allies for Tony in the next stage of the game. The merge of Cagayan is the low point of Tony's win, as his group elects to flip on the swing vote in Sarah Lucina. While Tony is included on that plan, he's not the one directing the ship. Cass is the head of that operation, and she elects to join Tony's side due to her relationship with Trish. It's also worth noting that Tony wastes his idol in that tribal council as he plays it on LJ, who receives 0 votes. That round is not great for Tony, but he dominates the rest of the season, beginning at the final 10. He starts by sticking with his original alliance and taking out Morgan, effectively reducing the Beauty tribe numbers. He then flips to knock out LJ, and in doing so, Tony solidifies his alliance with Wu. At Final 8, he flips back to his main group in voting out Jeremiah, and he follows that round with a third consecutive flip to take out Jeffra. That stretch between the Final 9 and Final 7 showcases some of the best strategic chops seen by any Survivor winner. At the same time, Tony is not navigating those situations by himself. He relies on the social work of Trish to help him rebuild those relationships. I know that some people discredit Tony's Cagayan game due to his dependence on Trish, but I think that you need to credit Tony for that relationship. Tony crosses Trish at the Final 7 in the Jeffra blind side, yet he's able to pull her back in and convince her to continue operating as his social facilitator. Through Tony's numerous flips in the mid-merge, he intentionally keeps those big jury threats like Spencer and Tasha as shields for later in the game. That strategy works out perfectly. Tasha is voted out at Final 6, while Spencer is sent home at Final 4. Tony's gameplay in that Spencer boot is really impressive as he lies and convinces the rest of the cast that his super idol was valid in that tribal council. You could argue that Tony's move there was somewhat facilitated by production-infused twists, but I don't see it that way because the idol itself was never actually played. You could also criticize Tony's decision to bring Spencer to the Final 4. The cast of Cagayan initially anticipated a 3-person Final Tribal Council format. Spencer was one immunity challenge away from that point, where he likely defeats Tony in a jury vote. Tony then reaches his ideal endgame scenario against Wu and Cass, where had this season operated with a normal 3-person Final Tribal, Tony wins the whole thing. By pushing the Final Tribal back one round, Tony needs to find an alternative path to the end. Wu then wins final immunity, and the decision seems obvious. Wu should vote out Tony and take Cass to the end, where he would undoubtedly win the jury vote. This is where Tony does his best work of the entire season. He plays on Wu's morals of honor and integrity and manipulates him into taking Tony to the final tribal. The fact that Wu falls for this trick really shows Tony's ability to understand his competitors and cater his arguments accordingly. In the final tribal, Tony defeats Wu in a 8-1 jury vote, and I think that Tony wins most other final tribal council combinations. So while there are some rough moments en route to the end for Tony, like his role in the Sarah boot and his arguments with Chaos Cass, he never faces any real consequences for those mistakes. He pulls off one of the most dynamic games in Survivor history, and he's in control every step of the way. He ranks here at number 6. Then at number 5, I got one of the most consistent winners on this list in terms of strategic agency. This player gains control on day 1 of his season, and he never takes his foot off the gas. It's Todd Herzog, the winner of Survivor China. Todd dominates this season with very little resistance. For this entire season, Todd is in the majority alliance, where he operates as a head strategic figure alongside his number 1 ally, Amanda Kimmel. Depending on your outlook on the Amanda-Todd dynamic, I could hear an argument for placing Todd in the co-dominant tier as opposed to this majority dominance tier. While yes, Amanda had influence in that pair's navigation through the season, I still look at Todd as the player with more strategic agency. I think that Todd was more outspoken in pushing the game towards his ideal final tribal council scenario. He makes strategic maneuvers independent from Amanda, and he convinces Amanda to cut her secondary allies while Todd keeps Courtney for the late game. Jumping right in, Todd is immediately in the majority of the Fei Long tribe. He establishes this core 3-person alliance with Amanda and Aaron, and he intended on propping up Aaron as the figurehead to be taken out later in the game. In episode 3, he makes the cutthroat move of voting out Leslie after she shared her clue to the idol with him. Then at the swap, Todd has the insightful play of passing James an idol with the instructions of throwing the upcoming challenge to vote out Jamie. Obviously, there's some risk there in James potentially acquiring 2 idols for the post-merge. At the end of the day, though, I like this idea from Todd in that it ensures that the Fei Long Alliance enters the merge with the numbers advantage regardless of which side wins that last tribal challenge. Moving on to the merge, Todd continues to work in the power seat, voting out many of the peripheral players like Jamie, Jean-Robert, and Frosty. That Frosty boot was crucial to Todd's game in that it forced Courtney closer to him. Throughout that section of the early merge, Todd and Amanda come forward as a legitimate duo, yet they are never seriously targeted. Then we get to the final 7, where Todd and Amanda pull off the James blind side, voting him out with 2 idols in his pocket. Todd had the idea for the James boot earlier in the season, but I generally give more credit to Amanda for this move, as she was the one leading the charge against James in that particular round. It's also worth acknowledging that Todd receives a vote at that tribal council, and had James played one of his idols correctly, he's in serious danger of going home on the revote. The final 6 marks the point in the season where Todd's threat level peaks. From that point forward, Todd is the primary target of the minority alliance. He receives votes in every subsequent tribal council. That's not great, but I still need to credit Todd for his relationships within his main alliance. That collection of Denise, Courtney, and Amanda remain fully loyal to him even when those players on the bottom claim that Todd would win the season if he reached the end. Todd's influence over Denise at the final 6 is especially impressive. In that round, we see Denise admit on camera that if she sticks with Todd's alliance, she's number 4 on the totem pole. At the end of the day, Denise cares more about her loyalty to Todd than her positioning within the game, and she refuses to flip against him. That alliance runs the endgame, knocking out Eric, followed by PG. By the time Todd reaches the final 4, he has a guaranteed spot in the final tribal as long as Denise does not win final immunity. Even if Denise somehow won that last challenge, Todd had Courtney's vote in his pocket. In the worst case scenario, Todd at least gets a shot at reaching the end through a fire-making challenge. In reality, Amanda wins the last challenge of the season, and she elects to take Todd to the end over Denise, which is insane. We then get to the end game where Todd delivers, in my opinion, the greatest final tribal council speech in the history of the show. He wins the season in a 4-2-1 jury vote. I think that one major fault with Todd's game is the fact that he relies on that spectacular speech to win the season. Unlike many of the winners ahead of him, Todd's win on China was not locked when he walked into the final tribal. There were many undecided members of that jury, and while it's impressive that Todd was able to convince them that he played the best game, I still take issue with the tight margin of victory. So we covered Todd Todd's win on Survivor China on the Survivor Analytics podcast around a year and a half ago, going into that season, I knew that Todd played a dominant game, but that rewatch served to elevate my opinion of his win. I'll rank him here at number 5. Then at number 4, I got the second perfect game to appear on this list. It's John Cochran, the winner of Survivor Karamoan. I know that many people naturally compare Cochran's perfect game on Karamoan and JT's perfect game on Tocantins, but I think that Cochran's win is more impressive by a solid margin. Yes, there are parallels between those wins. Both JT and Cochran vote in the majority alliance for the entire season. They both lock down a number 1 ally who they outplay and defeat in the final tribal council. The big factor that pushes Cochran ahead of JT for me is the fact that Cochran's number 1 actually wanted to ride with him to the end game. That was not the case for JT. But jumping right in, Cochran enters this season on the Favorites tribe, where he's immediately a part of the majority Stealth R Us alliance. The show paints Philip as the leader of that group, but to be honest, I have a difficult time believing that he was actually the head of that alliance. I see Philip more as the figurehead, while contestants like Cochran, Dawn, Malcolm, and Corinne actually ran things behind the scenes. Moving on to the merge, Cochran and Dawn are active in directing the vote onto Corinne at Final 12. That move not only established a new majority alliance, but it solidified Cochran and Dawn's bond with Sherry, who they later roll with to the Final Tribal. At Final 10, you get the historic Three Amigos Tribal Council, where every player on the bottom has individual immunity. That round is the only point all season where Cochran does not directly vote against the player who goes home. Even in Cochran's worst tribal council, he's still in the majority alliance, and he loses control only due to production-infused advantages. After that move, Cochran immediately regains control, and the rest of his game is straight-up dominance. He starts by picking off those players on the bottom, in Malcolm followed by Reynolds. At Final 7, Cochran recognizes that he's not a part of Andrea's long-term plan, and he orchestrates her blindside. Then at Final 6, he leads the vote against Brenda, which is the clearest example of Cochran outplaying Dawn. Through that point in the season, Brenda was much closer to Dawn than Cochran on both a strategic and personal level. By convincing Dawn to flip on Brenda, Cochran limits Dawn's paths to the end, and he sours the jury against her. Later on at the Final Tribal, we see Brenda literally force Dawn to take out her partial denture because she's so angry. It's the best strategic move in Cochran's entire Survivor career. From that point, Cochran runs the endgame alongside Dawn and Sherry, but there are external factors impacting those last couple rounds. Eric gets medically evacuated at Final 5. Some people claim that if Eric wasn't pulled from the game, then Cochran doesn't win the season, and I just don't buy into that hypothetical. Eric was the consensus target for the Final 5, and even if he won individual immunity there, I don't see him gathering the numbers against Cochran. I doubt that either Dawn or Sherry would be willing to flip against him. Then at Final 4, Cochran wins individual immunity and they take out Eddie. When Cochran sits in the end against Sherry and Dawn, it's not even close. He earns all 8 jury votes, and I think that Cochran wins most other Final Tribal Council scenarios. The jury of Karamoan absolutely loved him. I look at Cochran's run here as one of the best social games in the history of the show. Now, when it comes to Cochran's social game, we need to acknowledge the surrounding cast. Survivor Karamoan is infamous partially for the amount of pre-gaming leading up to filming. Cochran had a lot of outside-the-game friends on this cast. I get it if you want to knock Cochran on the basis of the quality of his competition, but that's not really something that I factor into these rankings. Plus, every returning player season features some degree of pre-gaming. So like I said at the beginning, I see Cochran's Karamoan run as the best perfect game of Survivor. It's a game where he's always in control with legitimate win equity, all while completely avoiding the target. I'll rank Cochran here at number 4. Moving on to the top 3, I can introduce the final tier of this list called Complete Dominance. These are the players who ran their seasons from beginning to end. They're the head strategic figures of their respective alliances, and they open multiple pathways to the Final Tribal through their strategic play. These winners reach the end of their seasons with loyal allies, and they obliterate their competition in a jury vote. I think there's a solid gap in the quality of the wins between this tier and the ones below. So at number 3, I got Boston Rob Mariano with his run run on Survivor Redemption Island. Rob's degree of control on this season is unlike anything that we've ever seen. He takes control of the numbers early, and he steamrolls the rest of the game until he ends up in his ideal final tribal council scenario. Redemption Island is remembered as one of the worst seasons in the history of the show, and I think that's in part due to the dominance of Boston Rob. He never faces any real adversity en route to the win. From the beginning, Rob has the numbers on his side, and he leads the first couple Ometepe tribal councils, picking off many of those players who actively opposed him. Francesca and Christina were the most vocal against Rob's alliance, so it's no surprise that both of them go home in the early game. At the merge, Rob pulls off his best move of the season. Matt returns from Redemption Island, and he considers flipping against Rob's alliance. In the end, he stays loyal to Rob, but Rob's group still votes him out. It's an incredible play on multiple fronts. It causes the opposing Zapatera tribe to burn their idol, leaving them powerless for the rest of the season. It maintains the loyal Ometepe numbers 6-5 for the following round, so they're still primed to control the game. Most importantly, it sends a message to the rest of Rob's alliance that he would vote them out if they even considered going against him. That Ometepe group is extremely loyal to Rob through the merge, and I think that the Matt vote played a large role in it. After the Matt boot, Rob runs Redemption Island like an old school season. He picks off every member from the Zapatera tribe for 5 straight rounds. During that stretch, there's a couple points where the Zapateras attempt and fail to gather the numbers against Rob, which is not great. When the numbers dwindle to just that Ometepe alliance, Rob identifies his ideal endgame scenario against Philip and Natalie. He works towards that destination by picking off some of the stronger physical competitors like Andrea and Grant. Andrea then returns to the game at the final 5, where she attempts to rally people against Boston Rob. She tells them that Rob would win in the end, yet they still vote her out. At Final 4, Rob wins Final Immunity, which opens the door for his group to knock out Ashley. Rob then wins the season against Natalie and Philip in a 8-1-0 jury vote. Natalie and Philip are both widely regarded as 2 of the worst finalists in the history of the show, so it's impressive that Rob was able to drag both of them to the end. It's a clean and dominant route to the final tribal. I genuinely considered bumping Rob up due to the sheer amount of control he maintains on this season. But similar to Brian Heidik, who we talked about at number 10, Rob had a horrible social game. He was perceived as the mob boss of that Ometepe group. He forces the 2 groups to sleep in different shelters and eat at separate times. He creates the buddy system, which prevents people in his alliance from strategizing with the opposition. Those are effective tactics in keeping Rob in power, but they also cause the Zapatera players to hate him. Yes, Rob wins the season handily against Philip and Natalie, but I think he loses most other Final Tribal Council scenarios. He more than likely loses to Ashley, meaning she was just 1 immunity challenge away from destroying Rob's entire strategic masterclass. That poor social play meant that there were just tight margins of error for Rob. The 2 winners ranked ahead of him may have held a bit less control, but they win their seasons against practically anyone in the endgame. So I don't know if we'll ever see a winner as powerful as Boston Rob. I'll rank him here at number 3. Then at number 2, I got a player who, like Rob, ran his season the entire way through. This contestant separates himself from Rob through both his jury management and his ability to overcome adversity in the game. It's Earl Cole, the winner of Survivor Fiji. If you watch my player ranking series, then you know that I put Earl in my top 10 contestants of all time, despite him only appearing on 1 season. This winning game is just that impressive. It's a game where Earl is always positioned as the head strategic force of his alliance, yet he's never seriously targeted. His name is written down just 1 time the entire season, and that vote was a throwaway from Rita in the pre-merge. Keep in mind that Earl never won individual immunity on Fiji. He was vulnerable at every tribal council, yet he was so well insulated socially that no one ever considered flipping against him. From strictly a positioning perspective, this is the greatest game of Survivor. Earl walks into Fiji as a member of the Have-Nots tribe that loses the first 3 immunity challenges. As his tribe slowly starts apart, Earl is working in the majority, where he locks down his primary allies in Yowman and Michelle. Later on at the swap, Earl is thrown into a group where the numbers are evenly split 3-3 according to original tribal lines. While that group never attends a tribal council, Earl takes that opportunity to build relationships with the likes of Cassandra, Boo, and Stacy. By the merge, those 3 contestants were more loyal to Earl and Yowman than their original tribe. Now, it's important to recognize that those connections were not solely facilitated in this section of the game. Survivor Fiji opened with a strange twist where all of the players resided on the same beach for the first day. During that time, Earl aligned with the contestants working to build the shelter, as well as the black players on the cast. Earl's game on Season 14 is nearly perfect, but I'll admit that he definitely benefits from that twist in the premiere. It's one of the few minor knocks against his resume. Later on in Episode 9, production includes a second tribe swap that snipes Michelle, Earl's second closest ally, out of the game. It's an incredibly unlucky scenario for Earl that never actually disrupts his strategic stranglehold on the season. We get to the merge where Earl maintains the 5-4 numbers advantage over the Four Horsemen's alliance. He does some very impressive work in that merge vote. Greens tells Earl that the minority alliance holds an idol, and Earl responds by leading the charge against Edgardo, the player least likely to receive that idol at Tribal Council. I also respect Earl's idea to tell Dreams the incorrect target. That move serves to test Dreams' loyalty, and it provides an extra layer of protection in the event that Dreams leak that intel back to the Four Horsemen. With Edgardo out of the game, Earl's side dominates the next couple rounds, picking off the remnants of the Four Horsemen in Mookie, followed by Alex. We get to the final 6, which is probably Earl's worst round of the season. He is technically excluded from the consensus plan against Yowman, who ends up staying in the game through an idol play. Earl was completely blindsided by the original vote, which is obviously bad, but that doesn't mean that Earl was on the bottom. Every other player in the game still wanted to ride with Earl to the end, they just didn't want Yowman by his side. Honestly, even if Yowman is voted out at 6, Earl still runs the endgame alongside Dreams and Cassandra. After the Stacy boot at 6, Earl dominates the last couple rounds, voting out Boo, then Yowman. Earl's threat level management in that stretch is absolutely incredible. Despite standing as the biggest jury threat on the board, no one ever attempts to vote him out. Even in the Tribal Council where Yowman goes home, he votes against Cassandra, not Earl. I know that the common criticism against Earl is that Yowman would have defeated him in the end, but I completely disagree. Yowman himself admitted postseason that he had no chance at beating Earl. When you look at that hypothetical final tribal between Earl and Yowman, I think that Earl has at least 5 locked jury votes, which automatically gives him the win. I doubt that Earl sweeps the jury in that scenario, but it's a win regardless. I'd also credit Earl for his identification of Yowman as the biggest jury threat at Final Four, as well as his willingness to cut Yowman there. In reality, Earl faces off against Dreams and Cassandra in the final tribal, where he receives all 9 jury votes. Overall, I look at Earl's win on Fiji as the best social game in the history of the show. Now, I think there's an argument for placing Rob ahead of Earl on the basis of strategic dominance, but I prefer Earl's game where he maintains slightly less control, but much more safety and win equity. I'll rank him here at number 2. We've made it to the number 1 spot. When I'm honest, this selection was not particularly close. I kind of knew going into this project that this player would rank at the top, and no other winners seriously challenged this game. It's Kim Spradlin with her run on Survivor One World. Kim's win on Season 24 is the most complete game of Survivor. She's firing on all cylinders here. Strategically, Kim is the head strategic figure directing votes for the entire season. Socially, she's adored by the rest of the One World cast to the point where she's rarely targeted, and I think she beats anyone from the post-merge in a jury vote. Then even physically, Kim ties the women's record for most individual immunity wins on a single season. I look at Kim as the second best Survivor player of all time, and that opinion largely stems from this winning game. From the beginning, Kim positions herself as the strategic pillar of the women's tribe. She builds this stable 5-person majority with many of the stronger physical players. Within that alliance, Kim locks down her core allies of Sabrina and Chelsea, both of whom appeared more loyal to Kim than each other. That alliance later runs the post-merge, so I need to credit Kim as the architect of that group. At the swap, Kim establishes a secret alliance with many of the former members of the men's tribe like Jade, Troyzan, and Michael. Those connections offer Kim a lot of safety and strategic flexibility in the back half of the game. At the merge, we initially see 2 larger competing alliances, but the truth was that Kim sat as the strategic pin of both groups. She then convinces the men to knock out one of their peripheral allies in Jonas, which gives the women the 6-5 numbers advantage in the following round. From there, Kim's side starts to pick off the men for 4 straight tribal councils, and she has some impressive plays in that stretch. At Final 11, she tricks the guys into taking out Michael, and while that move officially ends her swap tribe alliance, It also ensures that the women maintain a comfortable majority. At Final 10, Kim faces her only real adversity all season, where Troyzan comes up with this plan of idling her out of the game. Once again, though, Kim's connections pay off. Jay leaks this information back to Kim, and she has the killer instinct to flip the vote onto Jay himself, knowing that Troyzan will burn his idol at Tribal Council. That move essentially destroys the men's last hopes of flipping the game in their favor, and we see Leaf and Troyzan voted out back-to-back. We get to the final 7, and by this point in the season, Kim has the game basically locked and won. Every remaining player wanted to ride with her to the end, and she crushes any of them in a jury vote. She votes out Kat at 7, as she was the least trusted member of that women's alliance. Then at Final 6, Kim does her best work of the season in duping Alicia into thinking that Tarzan was the real strategic mastermind of the post-merge. Alicia had a chance at winning a jury vote against Tarzan and Christina, but she was blinded by her loyalty to Kim. By cutting Tarzan at 6, Kim positions herself perfectly for the endgame. Going into the Final 5, there were 2 Final 3 deals in place, both of which involved Kim. On one side, Kim had 2 of the most hated members of the Women's Alliance in Alicia and Christina, and on the other, she had her Day 1 allies in Sabrina and Chelsea. Now, Kim ultimately elects to roll with her original allies to the final tribal, and I think that move deserves some level of criticism. Kim potentially wins the season unanimously against the other pair, but it doesn't really matter. Even against Sabrina and Chelsea, 2 of the more well-respected players of Kim's alliance, she still wins the game handily, receiving 7 out of 9 jury votes. Kim connected with the jury of One World in a way that we rarely see on Survivor. While Troyzan and Leaf felt some bitterness towards her, everyone else loved Kim. And I bet she wins comfortably in just about every final Tribal Council scenario. There's only 2 real drawbacks that I see with Kim's game. The first is her relationships with Troyzan and Leaf. Neither of them vote for her in the final tribal, and Troyzan attempts to gather the numbers against her on 2 occasions. The second common criticism against Kim is the quality of competition on One World, but as I've said throughout this list, that's not really a factor that I include in my rankings, as it's something completely outside of Kim's control. So I feel that Kim's win on One World is the closest thing that we've seen to a truly perfect game of Survivor. Kim combines many of the best attributes of the winners in these top tiers. She's as well positioned as Earl on Fiji, she has as much control as Boston Rob on Redemption Island, and she has the win equity of Tony on Winners at War. To me, it's clearly the best winning game in the history of Survivor. So there it is, my complete ranking of every winning game of US Survivor. If you followed along with this series over the past month, thank you so much for your support. Keep following Survivor Analytics, where we will cover 3 seasons of Survivor per year. I also release a player ranking for each of those seasons, and let me know what kind of larger rankings you want to see on this page next. But again, thank you so much for listening.